Hi and welcome to the channel. I'm very excited to bring you this video today because it's a premier patron request from Eric M. He needed something for his terrain to help give it more of an Asian flair, so I thought a Torii gate would be a great way to start doing so. Want to see how it's all done? Stay tuned and let's check it out. Taking my bag of Torii mix-shaped wooden pieces, I pulled out the smallest square shapes, 4 of them, as well as 4 of the smallest circle shapes. What I did is glue these together. Now here I am using super glue, but you can even use tacky glue and wood glue if time isn't so much of the essence for you. Basically, glue 2 of these squares together, let the glue take, and then what you'll do is go back and just sort of even them out with a file if there's a little bit of lip on one side or the other. And then you're just going to place them to the side as you get working. Now we're moving on to these wooden square dowels. It's a package I found at Walmart, and they were just the right cut and shape that I wanted without things getting too fussy. If you cannot find these dowels, you can of course just cut out squared off strips of foam if you want to go that route instead. This just makes the guesswork a lot easier. Size-wise, I went with the 2 on the top row, so basically the largest one of the 2 at the top row and then the one right in the middle, and they do have the size markings on the packaging itself. So I picked these 2 out, and then what you're going to do is with your largest square dowel, you're going to measure out, in this case I went with 3 inches. Keep in mind, you can play with these measurements as well if you want your gates to be wider or taller. Just keep in mind that as you make these adjustments, it's going to end up being that for every larger square rod, your smaller square one is going to be a 1/2 inch shorter, is really how the formula for this works out. So I had the larger one measured out, and then I went in and I took care of the smaller one. And again, just make sure you have that 1/2 inch difference between the 2. Check yourself, make sure you like how the spacing looks before you do the cutting. Trust me, that's a lot easier. And once you have everything measured out, you're going to start cutting the dowels. And I used just a basic saw that I had on hand. You could also use, again, a dremel or the like if you have that. I did not, so I just went to my handsaw. And then you're just going to file it down either with sandpaper or a cheap emery board. Basically get it so that you get rid of all the jagged edges and you smooth it out so it's nicely squared. Now here's where the posts for the gate come into play. I actually used some chopsticks. There was no pun intended. These worked out perfectly for what I wanted to do with these gates. Again, the height can vary based upon what you want. I went with 3 inches again in this case. So I'm marking these off, getting them ready. Now, the nice thing about the chopsticks is you don't have to use a saw. It's not as dense of a wood as those wooden dowels are. So once you have it measured off, what I did is just take a nice strong pair of nippers and I basically just worked them around the chopstick, and it eventually just snapped it in 2. Save the other end of the chopstick because you can still keep using those for other gates. These chopsticks just had a really nice end to them, which came into play with the design work, fortunately enough. Again, sand them off, check their measurements, and then that'll give you basically the posts for your gate. Now let's glue everything together. Again, I'm using super glue. You don't have to. You can use the wood glue or the tacky glue. You do want to make sure you find center to both of your square dowels though. This makes it so much easier to make sure everything's spaced out nice and evenly and more balanced. Once you have the 2 measured out, you're going to make those 2 points that you've marked meet up with each other, so that when it comes time to glue, you'll place the glue onto the smaller dowel and then have it measure up against the larger one. And again, using those marks that you made of the center point to each of these, meet in the middle so that you have a nice point, and then your spacing is a little bit more on the mark and it takes out the guesswork for you. Obviously, let the glue take before you move on to the next step. While you're waiting for that to happen, what you're going to do is go back over to your chopstick, and now we're going to go back to those circles from the Torii mixed bag. Basically, get some glue on the end of your post, and you're going to glue it to the bottom, or the top rather, of one of these circles. Again, you're going to have to let the glue take. And if you're using super glue, I saved some of the sawdust and I sprinkled it around just to help it have a better connection. You can always file it down a little bit later or brush it off depending on how much you've used. Now that they're all set and the glue on the top post is set, we're going to move over to those squares that we had glued together as well. You're going to glue one more of those circles on top of the 2 squares glued together. This is basically just adding architectural detail interest to the base of your gate posts. When those are set, you're going to put some more glue on those and then attach your posts. In this case, do be careful and make sure that your posts are lined up so that they're working on a horizontal mode. They aren't tweaked a little bit so that they're working, so it's a 45-degree angle. You do want to be careful with placement with these, as you can see here in the photo. Make sure it's lined up side to side. Now, spacing comes in handy with your cutting mat. I wanted an inch space between the two, so I plotted them out on top of my cutting mat, put the glue on the top of the post, and then placed the top of the gate onto my post. This was actually very tricky to try and show on camera. Hopefully this gives you an idea of what I meant. Now for that crossbeam, that is that classic look to it. In this case, I did use the foam because that's what's needed, so I took my smaller dowel, used that as a gauge, cut off a bit that was measuring to that same width as the smaller dowel, and then I cut a smaller length of the foam and placed it up against the top portion of the gate, marked off where the posts fall in that measurement because this is, again, the same length as the smaller dowel. So mark off where you need to make these cuts, and then using a utility knife, you can then cut those pieces of foam out to make sure everything's lining up appropriately. Once you have that done, test fit your pieces before gluing them. Just make sure everything's lining up well. You do want them to be a little tight. Once you know you have it, put the glue on. In this case, I am using Tacky Glue. Do not use super glue with your foam or it'll melt. That's not fun. So gluing it into place with the Tacky Glue in this case, and that's something you can find in any craft supply area. You're going to place that towards the bottom. I gave it about an inch. This I sort of eyeballed more because of those little details that were in the chopsticks. And once you have that placed where you want it, then you can put on those end cap pieces. Same idea. Put a little bit of glue on either end of those bits and put them in place. And make sure this dries before moving on to the next step. Otherwise, you might pop some things out of place. I wanted to get that little square bit or rectangular bit that's in the center of the gate that you'll see on many of these gates. Again, this is the foam, the Dollar Tree foam core. And I cut it out so that it would be a 1/2 inch wide. Length is going to vary based upon where you place that cross piece. You may find you have to go back and shave off a little bit more before you get it placed where you want it to. That's perfectly fine. And once you get it sized up as you want, put that Tacky Glue on, or the white PVA glue, or I guess you could use wood glue if you wanted to. But you basically get it into the spot you want it to be. And again, let the glue dry before we proceed on. For the roof, I just used some chipboard, and again, the length, this is going to vary based upon how wide and tall you're making your gates. For the actual width of the strip, don't laugh, I just used my ruler for that. The important part is once you have that strip cut out, which ended up being about an inch, inch and a quarter, what you're going to do is you want to measure off a 1/2 inch from that cut, so you have a 1/2 inch wide strip. Now you're going to lay this on top of what is remaining from the other part of this cut of chipboard, and then you're going to very lightly score the excess area, as you're about to see here with the utility knife. You do not want to go all the way through. You're just scoring that upper layer of the chipboard. Then you're going to carefully bend the chipboard to start creating a right angle with the chipboard. This is going to help create that beam that's at the very top of the roof that you see on these gates. So once you get that cut out, what I did is I went back to my Tacky Glue just to get it to set into place a little bit more and make sure it was the angle I wanted it to be. You could use hot glue at this point if you so chose. I wanted to make sure that I had a little bit of more wiggle room to play around just in case the angle wasn't quite right. You can even test fit the top portion of the wooden dowel of your gate to make sure it's sitting nicely. The nice thing is that that little fold-over piece acts as a prop. Once that glue has dried, what you can do is go in and just basically round off the corners of these strips. You get that curvature that you see on the roofs of these Torii gates. You may have to go in and nip it here and there as you go along. I eyeballed it. You could always make a template if you want it to be more exact. I did then go in with my hot glue gun, put a strip at the top part of the corner to reinforce it, and then placed it on top of the gate, added some more hot glue around the upper portion of that wooden dowel, and then attached the roof to the rest of the gate using that method. You will want to make sure you're working quickly with this before the glue cools so that you can get everything positioned evenly. You can even put a little midpoint mark in as well, especially if you've left them on your gate, but this is what you should end up when you're done. I am giving you 2 different paint options because Eric asked if I wouldn't mind doing that when I gave him the 2 different paint options. So your first option is going to be the classic red and black. The second option is going to be a weathered looking Torii gate that has been out in the elements for who knows how long. Regardless, they are both going to get covered first with a mixture of pavement and Podge Matte. Make sure it is equal parts. This is going to help strengthen up the chipboard as well as the foam core that you have used for the crossbeam and the placard in the center. When you first start applying the red to the bottom portion of your Torii gate as pictured, what you want to first do is take your bright red from Apple Barrel as well as antique parchment, and you're going to basically put in a few drops of this antique parchment into your bright red. This is going to help make the red a little bit more opaque as it's going over the dark tone of the pavement. You still want that dark tone to show through just a little bit when all is said and done to add to the depth of the color, but the antique parchment helps blot out the darkness so it's not such a streaky multiple layer issue that you're going to have if you go just straight bright red. I did find that I had to apply 1 layer, let it dry, and then putting on that second layer really made the difference. After your second layer is dry, you are then going to go directly back to the bright red, and you're going to do a layer of the bright red, and you can see the difference once you apply that onto basically the cross beams and the posts of your Torii gate. You are leaving the roof, the placard, and the base of the post open to be painted black later. When you know your bright red is completely dry, go in just with basic black. You're going to paint the bottom of the post, which involve the 2 circles that were glued together as well as the 2 squares, the placard that is in the center between the 2 cross posts of the gate, and the roof of the gate itself. Let that dry totally, and then we're going to move over to adding a little bit of a gold accent. This part you can omit if you so choose. I went with an antique gold and I put that on the edge of the square dowels as well as the foam core beam just to give it a little bit of interest. For dry brushing, you're going to use sweet potato over the areas you painted bright red just to bring out some of those details with the edges. And then for the roof and the other areas painted black, go back to your pavement and use pavement for dry brushing in those zones. To give this more of a weathered effect, I took the folk art antiquing medium and nutmeg and I put that over the areas that have been painted red. And then for the black areas, I went in with the glaze and I used Café Noir. It's the same concept. Make sure both are done in a very thin layer. For the weathered approach, I am taking on the sponging technique, which is where you're going to take a cosmetic wedge sponge, just rip off the base a little bit so it gives it more of a texture, and these are the paints that I used working from one end to the other. You're going to start with pewter gray, move on to melted chocolate, jump over to camouflage, and finish off with territorial beige. So let's take a look at how these look as they apply. When it comes to working with these colors, you are going to want to make sure you do this while each layer is still slightly damp. So again, you're going to sponge on that pewter gray, get some good coverage on there, then shift over to doing the melted chocolate, not as heavy-handed in this round. When that is set, you move over to camouflage, same thing, pull back a little bit, you're not going as heavy as you move into the next color. Get your camouflage on, then you're going to move on to finally your territorial beige. And at this point, do let it dry completely. And you're going to go back over to that glaze Café Noir color, and like before, put on a very thin layer, let that dry to add to the aging effect, and finally you're going to round off with a granite gray as a dry brush over the entire gate area. This is where the painting differs because everything gets painted, not just the posts, not just the roof. They all get this same color treatment, so you end up with something that can look like a very weathered wooden or even stone gate in this case. And here we have our final look. Again, this was a special request from my premier patron, Eric M. If this is something you'd like to consider, do be sure to get over to my Patreon page. I do have a couple more slots of this option open to those who would like to be able to request certain video topics. If you have any questions about the build itself, please feel free to comment down below, or you can email me at thecraftingmuse.email@gmail.com. I really enjoyed changing it up a little bit and taking a new approach with the craft. I hope you did as well. If you've liked this video, make sure to give it a little thumbs up, and you are welcome to subscribe while you're here. Thanks so much everyone for joining me with this build, and I'll bring you another one soon. Take care. A warm welcome to new channel champion, Anthony S. Thank you so much for joining my Patreon community. I look forward to our future interactions. This is the last bit of silence I'm going to be getting all day. Thankfully, I record voiceovers in my closet. I'm not kidding. If you need a good place to record, go into your closet, because the clothes act as a really good absorber of sound, so there's not a lot of reverberation. Trade secret. If you want it. If you want to have a great recording, record in your closet. Hey, you want some behind the scenes? That's a behind the scene.